Part 4 of The Conflict of Mind, starting with Section 8. Point 1. The problem of justification is a critical problem for civilization, and it is especially a problem for pluralism. It is a problem of democracy that becomes ever more pressing as the society becomes ever pluralistic. Democracy has proven itself useful to help mitigate and arguably hide the problem by giving everyone a sense of solving it through the possibility of democratic debate, rational discourse, and the like, all of which, tragically, are ultimately, or at best often, fruitless, especially without force and/or action, due to the problem of justification and the possibility of ideological people forever maintaining a sense of being epistemically responsible by continually shifting their standards of justification. Democracy helps provide a way for people to feel as if societies can change their minds, when a change in leadership isn't necessarily a change in views. Changing leaderships provides a sense that views can change easier than they can. And yes, societies and people can change their minds, but the point is that they never have to change their minds, and it is unlikely that argument alone will ever bring about this change. And yet there is no guarantee that action will change society for the better, precisely because argument is so powerless to make people realize what is best. It is likely action will be blind. This doesn't mean everything action brings about will be bad, much of it will be good, but it does mean that it is unlikely the actors will be convinced of the goodness or badness of what they do by argument. Perhaps this subtly hints at why freedom is so rare in human history. If there are no objective standards of justification and in regard to what is unfalsifiable, then no one must believe anything that they don't want to believe, and they will still be epistemically responsible within their ideology. Admittedly, even in regard to beliefs that can be falsified, a person can just avoid tests of action, for example, and then the person will be able to genuinely convince his or herself of being intellectually honest, as is likely for us ideology-preserving humans, as discussed in The Truism of the Rational by O.G. Rose. The Truism of the Rational by O.G. Rose argues that the life of the mind is necessary for us to survive pluralism, but it seems that the mind cannot take us as far as we need to go. What is necessary cannot go as far as is necessary. It can take us to the finish line, but cannot cross it. Realizing this, it is tempting to throw up our hands and ask, why bother? But to give up is to fail far off from the finish line, where the consequences are worse than to fail right at the end, though perhaps still dire. Without the life of the mind, pluralism will likely collapse into radical skepticism and civil unrest. But without an objective standard of justification, perhaps the same will befall us. We seem forced to succeed at the impossible, like trying to see a mirror behind our face. There is no such thing as total certainty, as there is no such thing as total justification, only relative justification. There is the possibility of practical certainty and practical justification, but an objective justification seems impossible. This being the case, we in this pluralistic age must figure out what are we going to do, and in hopes of finding an answer, we will turn to the works of James, Davis, and Hunter, and Thought, Explored and Belonging, again by O.G. Rose. Rarely thinking about it, this is the start of point 2, rarely thinking about it, if ever, everyone lives according to a subjective standard of justification against which they define themselves as epistemically responsible and hence believe what they and everyone ought to believe. Being impossible to establish an objective standard of justification for what cannot be falsified, it is not possible to establish everyone ought to believe X, and this being the case, the more pluralistic a civilization becomes, the less likely it is to remain stable, especially if that society fails to take seriously the admonishments and advice of Hunter, offered throughout all his works, but most notably in his book, Before the Shooting Begins. It could be argued that the whole point of this paper on justification has been to help establish Hunter's profound correctness. As discussed in much more depth in Belonging Again by O.G. Rose, Hunter argued that we must change our focus in democracy from trying to prove the other side wrong and instead focus on finding a middle ground. By this, Hunter didn't mean so much a compromise as he did a space between different first principles about the nature of reality. According to Hunter's work, to use Aristotle's language, the challenge of pluralism is that people begin living together who don't merely think differently accidentally, but essentially. They don't share the same axioms or first principles about the world. In the ever-pluralistic democracy, Hunter was increasingly concerned about the kinds of debates and dialogues that emerged. He considered them attempts at groups to get one another to betray their first principles, a doomed enterprise. What Hunter warned was what he called what Hunter wanted was what he called a substantive democracy, which is a democracy focused not so much on changing people's first principles as it is looking for a middle ground, which all groups can agree to without betraying their most deeply held beliefs. To quote Hunter at length, let me be clear here, the common ground to which I refer is not dialogue in the vacuous sense often invoked by some ministers, marriage counselors, and conflict resolution specialists. It is rather robust and passionate and utterly serious civil reflection and argument. In this sense, it builds upon an agreement about how we should contend over our moral and political differences, a public agreement over how to disagree publicly. As George Weigel has put it, when an agreement is realized at this plane, genuine disagreements become an accomplishment and authentic debate becomes a virtue. Only in this context can there exist the possibility of forging politically sustainable solutions to the conflicts that divide us. If we are to survive pluralism, we must learn to find common ground between people of different first principles, versus learn to compromise with them, a seemingly insignificant change of focus that changes everything. As long as democracy continues in people's minds to be about whose first principles will reign and whose will be debased if not erased, every election will be a divisive election of great turmoil. If democracy demands people to sacrifice first principles, then the winner of the election is the group that must sacrifice first principles the least, if at all, while everyone else feels deeply dissatisfied, possibly to the point of violence. And do note, the people who win can still feel dissatisfied too. One part of civilization will have hope, while the other will lose it. The existential tension will be dire and likely burst, Hunter wrote. The problem, of course, is that when politics is framed as the only or primary solution to the public disagreement, because there is no substantive democracy, the only practical question people ask is about who is in control. Is it our party, our candidate, our side, or theirs? Indeed, the question of political solutions permits people to avoid or deny altogether the human side of controversy, as though cultural controversy could be formulated as a technical problem, permitting a purely technical solution. I have borrowed thoughts from Belonging again to help trace out Hunter's thought. Please see that work for a fuller description. Better yet, read all the works of Dr. James Davison Hunter. Considering the problem of justification, I see no other solution to put into practice than to put into practice what Hunter described. Alongside it, I also believe we should practice the liberal science of falsification that Rauch described in Kindly Inquisitors. Both men are, in fact, geniuses. Point 2.1. But is this middle ground Hunter discussed possible? Are we sure there is always a middle ground between first principles that will not require the abandoning of first principles? Knowing this would require being God, and note we will naturally feel there is no substantive middle ground, since it will demand of us not to get everything we want. But considering the practical benefits of assuming a middle ground, it is possible until we have reason to think otherwise, and keep in mind that we must start somewhere. We have reason to believe a middle ground is possible. If we find that it actually isn't after the utmost attempt, God help us all. 2.2. Hunter's work is not only needed because of the problem of justification, but also rational, far from a compromise of the life of the mind or a given person's first principles. Often people react to any talk of middle ground as intellectual betrayal. It is taken to be a lessening of the authority of beliefs for the sake of achieving inauthentic agreement that people's belief, if followed to their logical end, would not allow. Finding common ground is often taken to be epistemically irresponsible, which is exactly to be expected, as I hope this paper has made clear, seeing as a person's first principles are what define a person's epistemic responsibility. The nature of thought is to be against common grounds. It is epistemic responsibility itself which makes us skeptical and even antagonistic toward them, and failure to realize this trick of epistemic responsibility will make it unlikely we follow Hunter's invaluable advice. Seeking a middle ground is rational both because the nature of thought is such that it never has to be convinced to change, the map is indestructible, so trying to convince others to abandon first principles is irrational from a practical standpoint, and also because not trying risks civil unrest, collapsing politics, worsening tribalism, and even war. Furthermore, seeing the shifting standards of justification make it so that no one must change their minds over first principles, finding a middle ground isn't betrayal. Perhaps it would be more so if the map wasn't indestructible, but rather practical, rational, and necessary. That is, unless the person finds increasing social unrest risking a war and so forth, rational, and perhaps it would be for the time that those representing one's own first principles were in power, but that time would not last, and the period in of itself would threaten social order. The next section. Ayn Rand once said that in any compromise between good and evil, it is only evil that can profit. It is the nature of epistemic responsibility and thought to make us feel that a middle ground is necessarily an instance in which evil profits, even if this is not the case. There is truth to what Rand said, but that truth is likely lost if we fail to realize how epistemic responsibility will likely always make us think of ourselves as the good in a given compromise, and furthermore turn us against Hunter and his necessary guidelines for pluralism. It should be reiterated that Hunter wasn't advising a betrayal of first principles and their corresponding epistemic ethics, but rather a change in focus to finding a ground upon which people can meet without betraying or watering down their first principles, except as perhaps an utterly last resort. Yet it should be noted that thought and epistemic responsibility are such that any talk of middle ground is immediately taken as epistemically irresponsible and threatening, like a mouse reacting to the sight of cheese. The mouse has been shocked every time it is touched. We must learn not to be tricked by this knee-jerk reaction to turn against Hunter's work. Because of the nature of thought, we all must necessarily feel as if it isn't us who needs to be more toward the middle with our first principles, but those who don't think like us, as it is the nature of thought for those others to necessarily think the same of us. Realizing this can help cultivate valuable humility. Because there is no objective standard of justification, we can always avoid being compelled to think otherwise, always continue to make it epistemically responsible to maintain our position, and always make moving to the middle that which we ought to refrain from doing. Realizing all this can increase to us the sense that it is rational and even epistemically responsible to accept middle grounds in face of a sense of epistemic irresponsibility. Recognizing the conflict of mind can help us overcome it. 2.3. In an article titled "Moderates Are the Real Tough Guys," Oliver Berkman writes, "The problem with moderation," Peter Weiner argued in a recent New York Times essay, "is that it's seen as intrinsically livy-livered, a lukewarm compromise between more resolute extremes, a philosophy for tender souls," as John Paul Sartre said of liberalism. "I don't want to be moderately opposed to dishonest, bigoted, quasi-fascist politicians. When extremists run the world, we should be extremely committed to their defeat. Yet on the other hand, deep down, I know that a victory for my team over their team at the next election or referendum won't solve much in the long term. Either humiliating the other side simply ensures they'll come roaring back, more furious than ever, until they regain sufficient power to humiliate me." This paragraph is one I believe Hunter would resonate with, though Hunter may point out that substantive democracy doesn't require us to be moderate so much as it requires us to step into a middle zone with our first principles, though that is certainly what can be meant by the word moderate. If we understand the nature of thought, justification, and epistemic responsibility, we will better consider why it is we feel moderation is weak. Consider what Peter Weiner wrote. "In such a poisonous political culture, when moderation is precisely the treatment we need to cleanse America's civic toxins, it invariably becomes synonymous with weakness, lack of conviction, and timidity, fear. This is quite a serious problem, as Arlian argues in his superb and timely new book, Faces of Moderation, The Art of Balance in an Age of Extremes, in which he profiles several prominent 20th century thinkers, including Raymond Aron, Isaiah Berlin, Oakeshott, a professor of political science at Indiana University. He argues that the success of representative government and its institutions depends on moderation because they cannot properly function without compromise, which is the governing manifestation of moderation. Epistemic responsibility will always lead us to feel that moderation is intellectually dishonest unless we understand that it is rational because of how epistemic responsibility works, because the map is indestructible, because of what failing to listen to Hunter risks, and because democracy cannot work otherwise. Until we truly get in our bones that finding a middle ground is rational, it will be deeply unlikely that we will ever be able to overcome our epistemic responsibility, which will necessarily turn us against moderation. We recognize a sense of epistemic responsibility responsibility to combat a sense of epistemic responsibility. Otherwise, intellectual honesty will get the best of us. Otherwise, the conflict of mind will win. It helps to think about moderation as a disposition, not an ideology, to understand that looking for middle grounds isn't the same as believing something in the middle. It also helps to believe deeply something Raymond Aron once said. Freedom flourishes in temperate zones. It does not survive the burning faith of prophets and crowds. Lastly, it greatly helps to combat the epistemic responsibility against moderation by deeply understanding that it is the only rational option given that the map is indestructible and the problem of justification. That it is epistemically responsible to fight for a middle ground against the sense of epistemic responsibility which opposes moderation. To close with Peter Weiner, moderation is a difficult virtue for people to rally around, since by definition it doesn't arouse fervor or zealot advocates. But in a time of spreading resentments and rage, when truth is increasingly the target of assault and dialogue is often viewed as betrayal, moderation isn't simply a democratic quality, it becomes an essential democratic virtue. In this immoderate age, moderation must become America's fighting faith. We desperately need moderates, those who will act kind toward those they believe contribute to the murdering of the unborn, the spreading of racism, the warming of the planet, and yet a moderate is likely, if not necessarily, someone who is inconsistent with his or her beliefs. If we believe racism is destroying America, to find a middle ground with those who don't believe in institutional racism is to contribute to injustice. If we believe abortion is murder, to allow abortion in any circumstance to any degree is to fail to fully stand up against the genocide against the unborn. If we believe global warming is destroying the planet, to compromise with big oil is to flirt with the apocalypse. Considering these examples, moderation is existentially disturbing, can feel morally corrupt and epistemically irresponsible, and yet without moderation, civilization will fall deeper into existential anxiety and tribalism, be unable to agree on what constitutes justice, freedom, and the like, and be unable to participate in substantive democracy. Like Ulysses with wax in his ears, we must sail against the winds of the epistemic responsibility which blow us away from middle grounds. We have for too long been drunk on the Enlightenment and assumed by faith that the mechanics and motives of thinking would naturally harmonize upon an undeniable truth, making our only job to increase rationality in the society, and so save us from an existentially disturbing moderation. But the mechanics and motives of thinking do not ultimately harmonize. Thinking works, but it also works against itself. Do note, though, that if this paper is correct, and the conflict of mind is in fact inevitable due to the imperfections of rationality itself, then accepting imperfect moderation becomes more rational as a necessary tragedy, possibly easing existential anxiety. Next point, 231. Another reason why it is difficult to accept moderation is because if we believe X is true and we are logically consistent, and who thinks they aren't, we should believe that everyone should believe that X is true. This will especially be the case within ideological systems that stress evangelism, salvation, and the need to convert. Yes, when it comes to personal beliefs, we may be more understanding if people don't think like us, but if we believe X, unless we believe X is true just to us, which is likely an ad hominem fallacy, we will believe everyone should believe X. Considering this, logical consistency and epistemic responsibility both oppose searching for a middle ground, a responsible thing to do in our pluralistic age. If we believe in X, to not stand for X and not insist that people should believe X versus find a middle ground between X and Y is to do something that X would have us feel is intellectually incoherent and existentially unnerving, even though searching for a middle ground isn't the same as watering down one's beliefs, as Hunter noted. Furthermore, such moderation can make us feel like our beliefs are less authoritative, special, binding, and true, in the same way tolerance can lead to communities having less authority and power to provide belonging, as described in The Long Truce by A.J. Conyers, and as discussed in Belonging Again by O.G. Rose. What can help us combat this feeling is, again, by understanding deeply that we can look for middle ground with our deeply held beliefs. We don't have to abandon them. And furthermore, understanding that in our pluralistic age we have no other option. Even if we must risk the authority of our beliefs, to not risk them is to risk our civilization. Next point. Ideologies that stress the need to convert others, considering that no one must be convinced of X versus Y, are ideologies that are likely to cause great frustration, as members often fail to convert others democratically, precisely because of the problem of justification. This could lead to people using violence or various kinds of state force to convert, and frankly, this is probable given that it is ultimately action which seems to change people, as this paper suggests. This thought applies not just to religions, but also political ideologies, philosophies, so forth, and also hints at the accuracy of what James K. Smith discusses throughout his work, most notably in You Are What You Love. Next point. Another reason why it is difficult to accept any sense of moderation is because everyone necessarily believes that what they believe contributes to justice, beauty, goodness, and the like better than any other personal belief. As Augustine taught us, right or wrong, no one believes what they think doesn't contribute to justice, freedom, beauty, goodness, and the like. Furthermore, no one believes what they believe contributes to injustice and slavery. Even the white supremacist believes separating the races is just and contributes to freedom by helping the races be themselves. Twisted logic, of course, but the Augustine point is that if we do X, we believe X is good, to us, at least. A moderation of justice is to contribute to injustice. A moderation of freedom is to contribute to slavery. If we ascribe to X, then we believe that to moderate X or to even risk such is to fail to contribute in the world to justice, freedom, beauty, goodness, and or the like. And to do this is to fail to act morally and epistemically responsible. Yes, if we believe Y, it is self-evidently absurd to believe X contributes to justice, freedom, and so forth. But remember, what constitutes absurdity is relative to what we believe. For more on this topic, please see The Truth Organizes Values and the Trans Values of Justice and Love, both by O.G. Rose. The non-contingent values of justice, freedom, and so forth strengthen the sense that moderation is not only epistemically responsible, but irresponsible, but immoral. And all of us must necessarily feel that what we believe is true is that which best spreads these non-contingent values around the world. What I mean by non-contingent is that in no circumstance should these values be reduced. There should always be as much justice, freedom, and so forth in the world as possible. Yes, this means we still have to debate what exactly constitutes freedom, if freedom is possible without limits, the difference between freedom and nothingness, and so on. But whatever we believe constitutes a given non-contingent value is that which we believe should be unrestricted. But this again poses a problem to moderation. All beliefs necessarily carry with them ideas of non-contingent values and how best to spread them, and hence all beliefs will necessarily make moderation feel epistemically irresponsible and immoral. And worse yet, moderation will feel like a non-contingent trespass, a violation, an immoral act in all circumstances and to any degree. And this feeling is intrinsic to the structure and being of thought and belief themselves. If we think and believe, as all must, this feeling will be inescapable. All of this hints at the destruction and trouble that can be caused by our non-contingent values, which are necessary for humanity to have humanity. However, again, knowing the shortcomings of thought and its mechanics can make accepting moderation rational. Next point. We are likely driven by ideology and epistemic responsibility to accuse those, perhaps only in our heads, who claim we need moderation of being those who are secretly ideological and wanting us to moderate toward progressivism or toward conservatism and so on. This thinking is likely to impede our willingness to moderate. Next point. Another reason we are naturally against moderation is because we are naturally in favor of certainty. It is structured into our very thinking, considering Wittgenstein, and moderation can feel like a threat to certainty, as can empathy, encountering the other, and so on. All humans desire a degree of solidness to life, and where there is uncertainty and infinite, not in our finitude, possibility, there is a lack of solidness. Philip Rieff argued in The Triumph of the Therapeutic that a life of total freedom and hence total uncertainty is psychological hell. Though we want possibility, we don't want too much of it. Rieff was also concerned about society entering into an age of psychological hell and or existential anxiety due to what he called the triumph of the therapeutic. And what Rieff meant by this is explored in Belonging Again by O.G. Rose. Here, I only want to note that a reason that thinking is naturally toward certainty and against moderation is because thinking is naturally against falling into psychological torture. To ask people to moderate is likely taken by them, consciously or unconsciously, as asking them to risk psychological hell, and hell is always rational to avoid at all costs. Next point. Considering how difficult it is for people to overcome temptations to not moderate in the name of epistemic responsibility and truth, it is doubtful that more than a minority will do so, and in the way Hunter described. Considering this, it is doubtful any given democratic society will survive, for long at least. Next point. To reiterate, please don't misunderstand my use and support of moderation to mean that Hunter or I want people to be in the middle of their thinking. A centrist in Nazi Germany would be part of the problem, and it is not the case that being a centrist is necessarily a good thing. By moderate, I mean more so to moderate how one acts and thinks and to be willing to accept compromise. The idea of a substantive democracy is precisely that people don't have to abandon or move to the center from their deeply held beliefs, and it is my view that appeals to move to the middle have accomplished little and confused much. Of course, it depends on what is meant by the phrase. Point 3. Seeing as objective standards of justification are impossible, perhaps we should instead establish rules of justification that we can all agree on, even though they are ultimately arbitrary. The reason we have juries in court cases is precisely because of the fact that different people have different standards of justification. However, there is no jury in an individual, just one standard of justification. But if we were to establish rules of justification and logical social contract, it may help us achieve a substantive democracy by making democracy more like a court case. The rules of chess are ultimately arbitrary. There is no objective reason why it is the bishop that can move diagonally across the board instead of the knight, but the rules are what make the game possible. Yes, there is still a problem of justification here. I cannot objectively justify why the bishop should move diagonally and not the knight. But because everyone who plays chess agrees to the rules, this problem is practically irrelevant, and the rules practically justified. Perhaps if we could establish similar rules when it came to democratic debate, we could practically overcome the problem of justification. Perhaps we could better manage our inherently unstable situations. Changing our focus to look for middle grounds is a valuable rule we could establish, and we have Hunter to thank for his insights about substantive democracy. But this still leaves us with problems of justification, especially regarding what cannot be falsified, and it is in regard to this problem that democratic rules could be helpful. Why should anyone agree to play by rules or one set of rules versus another? Couldn't everyone just come up with their own rules and impose them upon everyone else? Indeed, but if everyone did this in regard to chess, the game couldn't be played, and it is because people want to play chess that they agree to the rules of chess established by those who invented and modified the game. If we as a society want to democratically debate, we should likewise want to debate according to rules that will make substantive democracy and the overcoming of problems of justification more possible. Below are a list of rules that could be used, and regardless if we accept them or not, I hope the point is clear that before a debate, it would be helpful to establish rules of justification. The first rule. A belief that is falsifiable but refuses to be tested is a belief with which parties are not responsible for finding a middle ground, for otherwise we could find ourselves having to find middle grounds with absurd and even insane ideas. Rule 2. Everyone should bring at least 5 pieces of strong evidence for a case, otherwise the case will not be considered. Rule 3. A theory that consists of more than 5 unfalsifiable deductions that are contingent upon one another will be considered a conspiracy theory, and though not necessarily false, it will be treated with less seriousness than an explanation reliant on a smaller chain of deductions, especially if those deductions can be falsified. Rule 4. All pitch and risk should be left outside of the debate as much as possible, and to the degree they must be included, nobody should be demanded to take them. Rule 5. Those entering the debate should have at least a basic understanding of epistemic methods, seeing as conflicts of mind are especially likely where epistemology is lacking. Rule 6. A person can only assert X is true to the degree a person can explain why X is true, for people cannot be persuaded that X is true unless it is explained to them, and where there isn't persuasion, there isn't democracy. More likely, there's violence. And so on. This is just a sample list. People can make up for themselves their own rules to make possible their own debates. We as a society could even come up with and publish a Robert's Rules of Justification per se. Yes, I am aware that these rules need a lot of clarification, what constitutes evidence, why 5 pieces of evidence and not 7, and so on. But my point here is only to provide an example of the kind of rules that could be practiced to help us overcome the problem of justification. One debate could follow one set of rules, another a different set, and so on. No, I don't think we should go up to random people and throw a set of rules upon them in everyday conversation, nor worry about such rules when having an everyday conversation, nor request for rules to be established as someone doesn't impose something they believe. Rather, the rules should be used for official or consequential debates, say in determining which beliefs should be passed into law and the like. I am aware that it is unlikely that everyday people in their everyday lives will debate one another and intellectually live according to some list of arbitrary rules of justification. However, just knowing about the problem of justification may inspire people to force themselves to living according to some firmer set of criteria for deciding to believe and disbelieve, to create a liberal science test for themselves per se, making them less likely to fall victim to natural tendencies to preserve ideology. If it is the case that action is more likely to compel than argument, as has been discussed, it is unlikely that we will ever be able to prevent the shooting from beginning, to allude to Hunter. And this is especially likely if we don't arrange rules that could help us overcome the problem of justification. Yes, the rules will ultimately be arbitrary like the rules of chess, and some will see the rules as authoritative and have every reason not to follow them, especially if they threaten what they believe, as arguably the rules will threaten everyone. Speed limits and tax procedures are also arbitrary, but it is easier to convince people to follow rules that can be seen as helping keep them safe versus rules that can be seen as threatening what they believe. But we need some kind of rules or social contract we all agree to. Perhaps it could be called an intellectual contract, alluding to Rousseau. Because the conflict of mind is built into reality, it seems we require arbitrary rules, as some may argue that we require God. Arguably, many works by O.G. Rose have attempted to provide various rules, procedures, and skills for the life of the mind, and to help us survive pluralism. Here, I have meant only to highlight example rules in regard to the problem of justification specifically. There is no guarantee the rules will save us, seeing as they are still subjective and people know they are ultimately arbitrary, so people can dismiss them if they don't like the results. But I think there is hope. To close with the words of James Hunter, despite his seemingly intractable pessimism, Alistair MacIntyre himself has suggested that one of the critical ways in which rival and incompatible positions on moral issues can be rationally resolved is by recognizing that different positions are not autonomous but are rooted within different traditions of rational justification.